Okay, so there's two main pieces of the second half of week 1 in my 8-week class, or week 2 in my other classes, and that is trying to discern what display to use when and what descriptive measure to use when. So let's just quickly break that down. All right, so we have two types of variables, and the type of variable really is what's going to lead us the rest of the way here. We have our categorical variables, and we have our quantitative variables, or numeric variables. I'm going to run out of space there. It's okay. So if we're talking about categorical variables, let's just choose something on a theme. Let's go with streaming service. So say we're talking about different shows and what streaming service they're available on. So if we're doing categorical variable, we have two displays to look at this. And this is what we're going to be doing in that looking at data discussion board that is next week for my hybrid class and is due this week for my online class. We have the option to do a pie chart. This might break down all the different streaming services. And we have the option to do a bar chart. Now, we do have some limitations of those things. A pie chart does require that we have non-overlapping data. So if there's something that's going to be available on multiple streaming services, or if we're talking about what streaming services people have access to, we wouldn't want to use a pie chart because it could be more than one answer, unless we said which one do you primarily use. And then a bar chart works all the time too. So those are our two displays that we could use for categorical variables. So just glance at them. In terms of numerics, there are two ways to summarize a categorical variable. We can just give out the total number, like a tally. So we could say this many people fell into this category, this many, or this many shows were available on Netflix, yada, yada, yada. Or we can use a percentage. Either one of those are ways to summarize a categorical variable. Now, quantitative variables, these have a lot more going on. We have lots of different displays. In terms of displays, we have our histogram, right? Which is quantitative world's answer to a bar chart. So this looks just like a bar chart. The only difference is that the bars are touching and our quantitative variables along the x in an increasing fashion. We have stem plots, which is when we take all of the first numbers and then we put the final digits on the other side of the stem. We have our dot plots. We just put dots for where things fall. And then we have our box plots, which give us a summary of our they give us a visual of our 5-number summary. If you're in the hybrid class, we get into our box plots in week 3. Those students in my 8-week class were already there. So only thing I want to say about these is typically stem and dot plots, these are really only good for small data. In fact, there's something you typically don't see except for in like intro classes where you're playing with really small data sets. In real life, we mostly look at histograms and box plots. There is, of course, a limitation to a histogram. A box plot. A box plot doesn't show me the shape of the underlying distribution like the histogram does. I can't tell how many modes something has in a box plot. I can sometimes tell if it's skewed to the left or skewed to the right based on the length of the tail, but it doesn't show me the number of modes. The limitation of a histogram is it doesn't automatically mark outliers like a box plot does, especially the modified box plot. So they do have their moments, each of those types of displays. Now, the second thing that was important in the end of week 2 for my hybrid class and for the end of week 1 for my 8-week class was the ways we can describe quantitative variables. There are 3 things we can notice about them. One of those is the shape, which we just kind of briefly touched on. center, spread, and unusual features. The other are the center and the spread. So we have two different types of numeric measures when it comes to quantitative variables. We have ways to measure the center or a typical value, and we have ways to measure the spread or how much variation there was in our values. So our two methods here that we're going to talk more about as the course goes on, we have median and mean for center, and we have IQR and standard deviation for spread. There are more center. There's the mode, which is a pretty common one. We've got mid-range. For spread, there's the range, and then there's other things like mean absolute difference. But these are the big four and the only four I test on. And the most important thing to know about these different ways to measure center and spread is when to use what and what the impacts are. So we only want to be using the mean and standard deviation if our original data is symmetric with no outliers. Outliers can pull our, I'm going to be off the screen. Outliers can pull our data over, our mean over, and make our standard deviation much larger than it actually really kind of feels like in reality. So just one person can kind of throw both those out of whack. Whereas the median and IQR, that's what we can use if our data is skewed or we have outliers. And they don't have any problems with that because the median just looks at the middle value and ignores the outliers that might exist on the high or the low end. And the same thing with the IQR. It just looks at that middle 50%. So this right here is sort of like everything that's important that happened in this last section that we covered. Is sort of how do we display these things? What do we use to summarize them in terms of numerics? And then, of course, there's some other pieces in there, like the fact that a right-skewed distribution will typically have a mean that's greater than a median, the nuances of those measures of shape for a histogram. So make sure you watch the little recap videos that I'll post for Knowledge Check 1, Knowledge Check 2, and that you understand everything that's going on. And if you don't, send me a message.